The night Karina Voss knocked on my front door, she was wearing a winter coat in July. That is the detail I always come back to. Not the mascara tracking down her face in 2 long rivers. Not the suitcase with the broken wheel she was dragging behind her. Not even the way she said my name, Adiz, like it was the only word she still trusted. What I remember is that coat, buttoned all the way up to her throat, like she was trying to hold herself together by force. I pulled her inside without asking a single question. That was always my fatal flaw with Karina. I loved her first and asked questions never. We had been best friends for 14 years by that night. 14 years of knowing each other's coffee orders, each other's mothers, each other's crying faces. We had been bridesmaids in each other's weddings. She had sat with me in the hospital the night my daughter was born 3 weeks early and weighed 4 pounds 6 ounces. I had sat with her in a lawyer's office 18 months before that night, listening to her husband accuse her of financial recklessness in a voice that made me want to flip the table. So, when she showed up at my door in a winter coat in July, I didn't think about the logistics. I didn't think about the guest room that was only barely a guest room, mostly a dumping ground for Christmas decorations and my daughter Lena's old art projects. I didn't think about my husband Dorian, who was sleeping upstairs and had a 5 a.m. flight to catch for a conference in Atlanta. I thought, she needs me. That was the whole thought, beginning and end. I made her tea. I found her clean towels. I cleared enough space in the guest room to make the bed. She sat on the edge of the mattress while I tucked the fitted sheet around the corners and she said, "I don't know what I would do without you, Adiz. You're the only person in the world who has never let me down." I told her to get some sleep. I turned out the light. I went back to my own bedroom and watched the ceiling for 2 hours before I finally drifted off. That was a Thursday in July. Karina Voss would stay in that guest room for the next 4 months. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. She stayed for 4 months, and I didn't find out the truth until month 3. By then, the damage was already done, and I had already started planning. I want to be precise about this, because the story doesn't work if you don't understand the full weight of what was on the scale. Karina's divorce from her husband, a man named Fletcher Voss, had been grinding forward for nearly 2 years by the time she showed up at my door. Fletcher was not a violent man. He was something worse, a man who made you feel like you were slowly disappearing. He criticized the way Karina spent money, the way she dressed, the friends she kept. He told her therapists were for weak people. He monitored her phone. He had a particular way of looking at her in social settings, a flat, measuring look that I can only describe as the look of a man who is constantly calculating whether you are performing well enough to justify keeping. I hated Fletcher Voss with a specific, righteous hatred that only comes from watching someone dismantle a person you love from the inside out. So when the divorce finally began, I was not just supportive. I was involved. I went to meetings with her attorney. I helped her organize bank statements for the discovery process. I drove her to her first therapy appointment because Fletcher had spent 4 years convincing her she didn't need one, and she was still shaking when she walked through that door. I paid for 3 months of those therapy sessions when her accounts got frozen during the divorce proceedings. I picked her up after every court appearance because she was too wrung out to drive herself, and I sat with her in parking lots while she cried, and I never once looked at my watch. My husband Dorian knew about all of it. He was not thrilled about the therapy payments. We had our own mortgage, our own bills, a daughter in her last year of high school, but he understood. He always said Karina was important to me, and he respected that. Or, at least he said he did. There is a sentence I keep turning over in my mind now, when I think about those early months. Dorian used to say, when I came home wrung out from an afternoon with Karina, "You give too much of yourself away." I always heard it as gentle criticism, as his way of telling me I needed to protect my own reserves. I thought he was looking out for me. I understand now that he may have been making a different kind of observation. When she moved into our guest room, Dorian had just been promoted at the architecture firm where he worked. The promotion came with travel, a lot of it. Conferences, client presentations, site visits in other cities. He was home maybe 3 weeks out of every 4 that first month. Then 2.5. Then, too, I didn't think much about it at the time. The promotion was a big deal. We had celebrated it together, just the two of us, at a restaurant we hadn't been to in years, and I remembered thinking that we were finally at a moment where everything we had built was going to pay off. Dorian's career moving upward. Lena about to graduate. The mortgage halfway done. Everything steady and forward-moving. And I was busy. Karina needed a lot. She cried, often and deeply, in the way that people cry when they have been told for years that their feelings are inconvenient. She cried at breakfast. She cried in the car. She cried watching television, even things that weren't sad. I sat with her through all of it, and I'm not telling you that to cast myself as a saint. I'm telling you because it is important that you understand that my attention was completely and entirely consumed by her pain. I was functioning at 100% in the direction of someone else, which meant I was functioning at something much less than that in my own home, in my own marriage, at my own dinner table. I was not watching anything else. Lena, my daughter, came to me one evening in the second month and said, "Mom, I feel like I live in a hotel now." She was 17, old enough to be awkward about saying it, but young enough that it still came out honest. I told her Karina just needed a little more time. I told her things would go back to normal soon. Lena nodded in that teenage way that means, "I don't believe you, but I love you too much to say so." I made Karina a home inside my home. I shielded her from every inconvenience I could find. I even started handling the grocery shopping differently, buying things Karina liked, building the weekly meals around what was easiest for her, cooking dinners that the three of us sat down to together on the nights Dorian was home. Those dinners. I keep coming back to them. The three of us sitting at my dining table. My good dishes. Karina laughing again, finally, that full-body laugh I had missed, the one that used to fill every room she was in. Dorian pouring wine. Me watching both of them and thinking, this is what love looks like. Being the person who creates the space where the people you care about can breathe again. I thought I was building something. I thought I was holding two separate things together at once, my friendship and my marriage, and doing it well. I was. Just not in the way I understood. One of the things I have had to sit with, in the years since all of this happened, is the question of what I missed. Not what they hid from me. I have no interest in giving either of them credit for cleverness. But what I genuinely did not see, because I was not positioned to see it. The dinners. The three of us at that table. Karina was not just a guest recovering at my table. She was already something else by the time she was sitting in my dining room laughing. And Dorian, pouring wine, filling glasses, asking her questions about her therapy sessions in that attentive way he had. He was not just being a hospitable husband. He was doing something else entirely. I did not see it because I trusted both of them. Not blindly. Based on 14 years of evidence with one and 12 years of marriage with the other. You do not spend that long building a foundation with two people and then, at dinner in your own home, think to look underneath the table. You just eat. You just talk. You just think, this is what holding people together looks like. And then, on a Tuesday night in late October, I reorganized the front closet, and everything I thought I had built came apart in the time it takes to unfold a piece of paper. The coat was not mine. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I was not going through anyone's things. I was not suspicious. I was not the kind of wife who checks pockets or reads phones. I had never been that woman, and I had no particular reason to become her on that Tuesday in October. Dorian was in Denver for a 3-day conference. Karina was out. She had started going to a weekly support group for women coming out of controlling relationships, something her therapist had recommended. Lena was at her friend's house studying for the SAT. I was alone in my house for the first time in 3 months. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 3 months. I had not been alone in my own home for 3 full months. Every morning I had woken up and immediately begun orienting myself around someone else's needs. Every evening I had gone to sleep with another person's emotional weight still sitting on my chest. The guest room light had been on every night since July. For one evening, the house was quiet. I decided to do something I had been putting off since July, reorganize the front closet. It had become a disaster. Everyone's coats layered on top of each other, boxes shoved in at strange angles, an umbrella graveyard building up in the back corner. I wanted an hour of quiet, useful work. Something I could finish and stand back from and feel satisfied about. I have always been someone who processes through tidying. When things feel out of my control, I find something I can physically organize and I do it until my mind slows down. It is not a complicated system. It works. I started pulling things out. And that is when I found the coat. It was a light gray wool peacoat, women's size small. It was not mine. I am not a size small, and I do not own gray wool. I assumed it was Karina's, left behind when she'd grabbed her heavier winter coat from home during one of her supervised visits to collect belongings from the house she'd shared with Fletcher. I held it up, checked the pockets before hanging it properly, because that is just what you do. You check pockets before you hang something. You do it without thinking. Everyone does. The left pocket was empty. The right pocket had a folded piece of paper in it. I am not going to pretend there was a moment of hesitation. There wasn't. It was a coat in my closet. I unfolded it. It was a hotel receipt. The Meridian Suites, downtown. A weekend stay, Friday check-in, Sunday check-out, from 3 weeks earlier. The name on the receipt was Dorian Quay, my husband. I stood there in my front hallway for a long time. Long enough that the hall light, which is on a motion sensor, clicked off. I stood in the dark holding that piece of paper, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound. My brain did something very strange in that moment. It did not spiral. It did not flood with images or accusations or the kind of cinematic montage that people describe in these moments, flash cuts of expressions you missed, conversations you reread with new eyes. None of that happened. My mind went completely, absolutely still. It was not shock, exactly. It was more like my mind going into a kind of emergency operational mode. Like a system that detects a catastrophic failure and immediately begins rerouting power away from emotion and toward function. Like a fuse box, where everything in the house goes dark for 1 second, and then the backup system kicks on, and the lights come back up in a different configuration. I folded the receipt exactly as I had found it. I put it back in the pocket. I hung the coat in the closet. Then I went to the kitchen, made a cup of chamomile tea, sat down at the table, and started thinking. The receipt was in Karina's coat. Not Dorian's coat. Not something I had found in our bedroom or in his car or in the pocket of the blazer he'd worn to the conference 3 weeks ago. Karina's coat. Which meant Karina had the receipt. Which meant Karina had been there. Which meant the weekend stay at the Meridian Suites, the one with my husband's name on it. That was not a solo business trip. That was not a night Dorian had checked in alone. The weekend in question was when Dorian had told me he was in Columbus for a client presentation. I had texted him twice that Saturday. He had responded both times within 10 minutes. That detail had felt, at the time, like evidence of a good marriage. A man who texts back. I had even said something to Karina about it, something offhand like, he's been so good about staying in touch even when he's traveling, and Karina had smiled and said, "You're lucky." He'd sent me a photo from what he said was the hotel gym. I had sent back a heart emoji and told him not to work too hard. I went upstairs to my office and opened my laptop. I pulled up the website for the Meridian Suites. I navigated to the amenities page. I found the hotel gym, a clean, modern room with a particular arrangement of equipment, a specific row of treadmills against a window. I went to my phone and pulled up the photo Dorian had sent. The equipment was different. The window was on the wrong side. That was the moment. Not the receipt. The receipt was the evidence. The photo was the architecture. The photo told me that Dorian had not just taken a trip with Karina. He had constructed a parallel reality, complete with photographic props, designed specifically to be shown to me. He had not made a careless mistake. He had made a careful plan. That is a different kind of thing to absorb. I sat in my office for a long time with the lights off. Long enough that outside the window the evening went from gray to full dark. I could hear the refrigerator humming downstairs. I could hear a car pass on the street. Normal sounds. The sounds of a house that had no idea what had just happened inside it. I thought about the 14 years. I thought about every specific act of loyalty I had extended to Karina, not as a list, not as an accounting exercise, but the way you think about them when you're sitting in a dark room and trying to understand what they were worth. The hospital, the lawyer's office, The therapy sessions I had paid for with money that was also Dorian's money, I realized now, which meant Dorian had helped fund his own alibi. The dinners. The closet, I had just reorganized to make room for her things. I thought about the way Karina had looked at me across the dining table, laughing, the way she always laughed, full and warm, and I thought, she looked me in the eyes every single day, for 3 months. Every single day. I did not cry that night. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the crying to come immediately, and it did not. What came instead was something I have since come to think of as the coldest version of clarity I have ever experienced. A clarity that had no warmth in it at all. A clarity that felt less like understanding and more like the moment a surgeon makes the first incision, precise, committed, and utterly without hesitation. I went back downstairs. I made a second cup of tea. I got a legal pad for my home office. I sat at the kitchen table. I wrote the date at the top of the page. And then I started writing. I wrote for 2 hours that night. By the time I was done, I had a plan so complete that my attorney, when she read it 3 days later, said she had never had a client walk in that prepared. But before any of that, I had to survive 3 more weeks inside that house. And that is the part that almost broke me. Here is what most people do not understand about discovery. The first instinct is almost always wrong. The first instinct is to burn it down, to stand in the doorway and scream, to throw things, send texts, call them others, to make sure everyone in a 2-mile radius knows exactly what kind of people live here and what they have done and what you think of them, to make your pain so loud and so immediate that nobody can look away from it. I am not saying that instinct is wrong. I am saying it is fast. And fast almost always serves the person who betrayed you, not you. Because if I had confronted them that night, or even the next morning, when Karina came home from her support group and set her bag on my kitchen chair and asked how my evening was, what would have happened? Karina would have cried. She was extraordinarily good at crying. I had watched her do it in lawyers' offices, in parking lots, in my own kitchen, at a therapist's reception desk while the receptionist looked uncomfortable. Karina's crying was not manipulation exactly. I believe her pain was real, has always been real, but it was also, whether she intended it or not, a tool. When Karina cried, everything in the room reorganized itself around her. You stopped talking. You stopped making your point. You moved toward her, instinctively, the way you move toward something that is in pain, and by the time she was done you had lost the thread of whatever you had been trying to say. She would have said, she didn't mean for it to happen. That it developed while she was in such a dark place. That she had been so lost inside her own grief, inside the wreckage of her marriage to Fletcher, that she hadn't been thinking clearly. She would have made her darkness so present and so vivid that the conversation, without either of us fully intending it, would have shifted from being about what she had done to me, inside my house, in my guest room, with my husband, to being about her pain and what she needed to heal from it. I know this because it is exactly what she did later, in other settings with other people. But I am getting ahead of myself. Dorian would have apologized. He was good at apologies, considered apologies that acknowledged the specific thing he had done without leaving too much room for follow-up questions. He would have used words like mistake and lack of judgment, and I don't know how I let this happen. He would have looked at me in the particular way that had worked on me for 12 years, the way that said, I am a flawed person who loves you, and I am asking you to hold both of those things at once. And what would I have had? An argument I hadn't prepared for. Evidence I'd already revealed, which they would now know to explain away or minimize or lose. And no plan. Just my own raw pain, which is the worst negotiating position you can possibly be in. I have been in enough courtrooms with Karina to understand one thing at a foundational level. Preparation is not just helpful. Preparation is the only thing that separates the person who walks away with what they're owed from the person who walks away with nothing but the memory of a fight they lost. You do not walk into a room until you know exactly what you're going to say, exactly what you're going to do, and exactly what happens next no matter which way it goes. So I got quiet. Quiet in a way that I had never been in my life. A quiet that required more sustained effort than anything I have done before or since. Because quiet, when you are carrying what I was carrying, is not passive. It is the most active thing you can do. Every morning I had to make the choice again. Every breakfast, every dinner, every casual evening in the living room with the television on. Every time Dorian kissed me at the door. Every time Karina said my name in that warm voice. I made the choice every single time. Silence. Not yet. Not until I'm ready. I went back downstairs the night I found the receipt and finished reorganizing the closet. When Karina came home from her support group around 9:30, I had tea waiting and asked her how it went. She said it was good. She said the women in the group were incredibly strong, that hearing their stories made her feel less alone. I told her I was proud of her for going. I looked at her face while she said it. I looked at it the way you look at a painting you thought you understood, but are now seeing with different eyes. The same face, the same warmth, the same ease with which she took up space in my kitchen. And underneath all of it, something I could now see that I had not been able to see before, not because she was hiding it perfectly, but because I had never had a reason to look. She was comfortable, not the comfort of a guest who is grateful. The comfort of someone who has decided this space is hers. When Dorian got home from Denver 2 days later, I kissed him at the door and asked about his trip. He told me it had gone well, that the client was impressed, that the presentation had landed better than he'd expected. I told him I was glad. I said, I missed you. He said he missed me too. I have thought about that exchange many times. I said I missed you, and I meant it, because whatever else was true, whatever had been built behind my back inside my own house, I had spent 12 years building a life with this man, and some part of me missed the version of him I thought he was. That version was already gone. I just didn't have the paperwork yet. That night in bed, I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe. He fell asleep quickly, the way he always did, that particular talent for unconsciousness that I had always lightly envied. And I lay there in the dark and thought, you are sleeping in my house, next to my body, and you think you are safe. You are not safe. Over the next 3 weeks, I did everything I needed to do in the margins of an ordinary life. I kept working. I kept cooking. I kept driving Lena to school and picking her up and asking about her day. I kept sitting with Karina in the evenings. I kept being the wife Dorian expected to come home to. And in the spaces between all of that, on my lunch breaks, in my car, in my home office after everyone was asleep, I built the thing that was going to outlast all of them. The first call I made was to a divorce attorney. Not the one Karina had used, obviously, but a woman named Priscilla Osemensa, who worked out of an office in a part of town where I was unlikely to run into anyone I knew. I had found her through a colleague who had gone through her own divorce 2 years prior, and described Priscilla as the kind of attorney who makes the other side feel like they showed up to a knife fight with a plastic spoon. I sat across from Priscilla on a Tuesday afternoon and told her everything. All of it. The receipt. The photo. The dates. The 4 months of guest room hospitality. I told it flat and factual, without crying, which I could see surprised her. When I was done, she looked at me for a moment and said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want everything I'm entitled to. I want it documented. I want it airtight. And I want it done before either of them knows it's coming." Priscilla smiled. It was a small smile, precise and professional. She said, "Then let's talk about what you're going to do in the next 3 weeks." She told me what to document, what not to touch, and what to begin moving quietly, legally, properly. She told me which financial accounts I had individual access to and what I could do with them without triggering a flag. She told me what not to say, to whom, and under what circumstances. She mapped it out like architecture, which I found appropriate, given my husband's profession. The second call I made was to a private investigator. I chose a woman because women are better at being invisible in the places where invisibility matters. Her name was Renata Flor, and she had a plain, practical face and a manner so neutral it was almost calming. I gave her the hotel receipt, the photo discrepancy, and the dates of every business trip Dorian had taken in the past 6 months. She told me she would have a preliminary report within 10 days. The third thing I did was go through my own finances with the kind of attention I had never applied to them before, not because I had been careless, but because I had trusted that our financial life was what it appeared to be. What I found, over 2 evenings with the bank statements spread across my home office desk, was careful but traceable. Small cash withdrawals, the kind a man makes when he doesn't want to leave a card trail. 2 charges at a restaurant I had never been to and had not been mentioned. A flower delivery. I found the confirmation in an old email thread that had not arrived at our address, billed to a card we shared. Small things. The breadcrumbs of a man who thought he was being clever. I photographed everything. I organized it in a folder on a USB drive that I kept in my car, in a compartment Dorian had no reason to open. I labeled the folder with the name of a client project, which I am aware was its own small act of calculated deception. I did not feel guilty about it. Renata came back to me in 8 days, not 10. She had photographs. I will not describe them in detail. There is no need, and some things do not require elaboration. What I will say is that they were taken at a hotel in Cincinnati, not the Meridian Suites, a different one, on a date when Dorian had told me he was in Philadelphia for a site review. And in those photographs, the woman with my husband was wearing a light gray wool peacoat. I sat across from Renata's desk and I looked at the photographs with the same stillness I had been practicing for 3 weeks. When I finished, I looked up and I said, "How many times total?" Renata said she had documentation for at least 5 occasions. The first one was approximately 1 month after Karina moved into my house. 1 month. Karina Voss had been sleeping under my roof, eating my food, crying in my arms for exactly 1 month before she started sleeping with my husband. She had sat across from me at my dining table for 1 month. She had accepted my grocery shopping and my therapy payments and my time and my presence for 1 month. And then she had started this. I thanked Renata. I paid her invoice in cash. I drove home. Karina was in the kitchen making a salad when I walked in. She smiled at me, that wide, warm smile that I had loved for 14 years and that I now understood differently. She said, "There's dressing in the fridge if you want some." I said, "Thank you." I set my bag down. The 3 weeks I had been waiting were up. Everything I needed was in place. Priscilla had the documents. Renata's report was in the file. The financial untangling had been completed in careful increments. Everything moved that could legally be moved, everything documented that needed to be documented. Now I could move, but not yet, not tonight, because there was one more thing I needed to do before the confrontation. One thing I had been thinking about for 3 weeks, the thing I had identified on the very first night, the night with the coat, the receipt, the dark hallway, as the move that would matter most in the long run. The move that wasn't legal or financial. The move that was personal. I needed to call Miriam. Miriam was Karina's mother, and she was the one thing in Karina's life that Karina could not survive losing. I had known that for 14 years. Now I was going to use it. There is a specific kind of power that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't know you know. I had been living inside that power for 3 weeks, and I had used every hour of it. I called Miriam on a Friday morning. Dorian had left for work. Karina was at a coffee meeting with someone from her old professional network. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone, and I called the woman I had known for 14 years, who had called me her second daughter, who had danced with me at Karina's first wedding, who had texted me on my own birthday every single year without fail. Miriam answered on the second ring. I told her everything. Not in the collapsed, emotional way, the factual way. The same way I had told Priscilla. The dates, the documentation, the hotel receipt, the photographs, the 1-month mark, the dinners at the table. I told her all of it, and I told it in a straight line from beginning to end, without editorializing, without breaking down, without asking her for anything. When I finished, there was a silence on the line. Then Miriam said, "How long have you known?" I said, 3 weeks. She said, "You waited 3 weeks before calling me?" I said, "I needed to be sure I had everything I needed before I did anything." Another silence. Longer this time. Then Miriam said, quietly, and I have heard this sentence in my memory so many times in the years since that I could reproduce every inflection of it. "Thank you for telling me, Adiz. I am so very sorry." She did not defend Karina. She did not ask if I was certain, or suggest there might be another explanation, or say something about how her daughter had been through so much. She just said she was sorry, which told me that Miriam was not entirely surprised. which told me something I had suspected but not confirmed, that Miriam had seen things over the years that she had chosen not to examine too closely. I told Miriam I appreciated her. I told her I wasn't calling to put her in the middle of anything. I just thought she deserved to know the truth about what her daughter had done, because Miriam was someone who deserved the truth. We talked for 40 minutes. Before we hung up, Miriam said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "What I need to do." She said, "Good." I had told Miriam because Miriam was the one person in Karina's life whose opinion she could not dismiss or survive without. Karina had survived Fletcher's contempt. She had survived the court proceedings, the financial freeze, the humiliation of a controlled marriage unraveling in public documents. She had survived her own worst nights, her own darkest thoughts, the long, empty mornings of a life she was trying to rebuild from scratch. She could not survive her mother's disappointment. Not in the way that Miriam's disappointment came. Not loud, not dramatic, not in the form of a phone call full of accusations. In the form of a changed quality of presence. In the form of a mother who knew what her daughter had done and now had to look at her across the table knowing it. That was the specific punishment that fit the specific crime. Because what Karina had done to me was exactly that. She had looked at me across the table every day knowing what she had done. Now she would know what it felt like to be the one being looked at. I arranged Lena to be at my sister's house for the weekend. I chose a Friday evening. Dorian was home, Karina was home, the house was quiet. I sat them both down in the living room. My living room. The one with the couch I'd bought, the curtains I'd chosen, the family photographs I had hung on the walls myself over 12 years of marriage. I did not raise my voice once. I put Renata's report on the coffee table between us. I put the hotel receipt beside it, the one from the gray coat, the one I had found in the closet on the Tuesday night 3 weeks ago that had started all of this. I told them I had documentation of 5 incidents, the dates, the locations, the names on the reservations. I told them I had been meeting with my attorney. I told them the divorce filing had been initiated, quietly, legally, completely, and that Dorian had been served that afternoon by a process server who had gone to his office. His assistant had signed for the envelope. Dorian went white. Not pale, white. The color left his face in a way I had never seen before and have not seen since. Karina said my name. Just my name, once, in a voice that was already the beginning of a speech I knew by heart. The opening note of the crying voice, the please listen to me voice, the I was a Park Place voice. The voice that reorganized every room around her pain. I held up one hand. I said, "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to tell you both that I know that it's over and that you need to make other arrangements by the end of next week." Then I said, "I also want you to know that I called your mother this morning, Karina. I told her everything." The room changed. I have tried to find the right words for what happened to Karina's face in the seconds after I said that, and the closest I can get is this. It collapsed inward. Not dramatically, not in the way of a person who is about to cry or yell or throw something. Inward and downward, like a structure whose load-bearing wall has just been removed. Like someone had reached inside her and turned off a light. She did not cry. For the first time in 4 months, for the first time since July, since the winter coat at the front door, since the first night she had sat on the edge of my guest room bed and told me I was the only person who had never let her down, Karina Voss sat completely still. And I looked at her sitting still in my living room, in the silence of a house she had taken up residence in, and I thought, there it is. That is what the truth looks like on her face. I stood up. I told them both good night. I walked upstairs. I closed my bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed. And then I cried. Not for them. Not with anger or grief, or any of the things I had been holding back for 3 weeks. I cried the way you cry when something enormous and terrible is finally, definitively over, the kind of crying that is not pain but release. The kind that leaves you feeling like the inside of something that has just been cleaned out. I sat there until it was done. Then I washed my face. I got into bed. I turned out the light. I slept better than I had in months. But there was one more piece, one I had not planned, one that I could not have arranged even if I had tried. It happened 3 days later in front of people, and it was the moment this story stopped being private. I need to tell you about the Monday. 3 days after the living room. Dorian had already moved into a hotel. He'd left Saturday morning with 2 bags and the quiet, careful movements of a man who understood that he had no ground left to stand on. Karina was still in the guest room, which she had told me she needed a few more days to arrange, and which I had agreed to because I no longer needed her to leave dramatically. She could leave on her own schedule. The damage was already done. What I had not known, when I made the decision to involve Miriam, was how quickly Miriam would act on what I told her. Miriam called Karina's aunt, her mother's sister, a woman named Georgette, who lived 40 minutes away and had been a consistent presence in Karina's life since childhood. Miriam, I later learned, did not call to gossip or to condemn. She called because she was a woman in her late 60s who had just received devastating news about her daughter and needed to say it out loud to someone she trusted. That is a human thing to do. I do not fault her for it. Georgette told her own daughter. Her daughter happened to be friends, through a local women's networking group, with a woman who had once worked with Karina at the marketing firm where Karina had built her pre-Fletcher career. A woman named Delia Marchetti, who was warm and connected and who had, over the previous month, been one of the people helping Karina rebuild her professional network. By Monday morning, Delia knew. I did not plan what happened Monday. I want to be clear about that. I had gone to a quarterly professional luncheon, something I attended 3 or 4 times a year, a mid-sized gathering of women in consulting, communications, and organizational leadership. I had RSVP'd to this luncheon before any of this happened, and I almost didn't go. But Priscilla had told me, specifically, to continue living my normal life and not to withdraw from my professional routines, because doing so could be used to suggest emotional instability in any subsequent proceedings. So, I went. I walked into the event room, a private dining space at a downtown hotel, round tables, 40 or 50 women, the comfortable noise of professional women networking over a set menu, and within 60 seconds, I understood that the information had arrived before I did. I knew it from the way conversations adjusted when I walked past. Not dramatically, just the small recalibrations that people make when they have information about someone who has just entered a room. The micropause. The slightly too warm greeting. The eye contact that holds a fraction too long. I found my table. I sat down. I ordered water. I was not going to leave. Delia Marchetti was 2 tables away. At some point during the main course, she came over. Delia was a good woman, I want to say that. She was not malicious. She came over because she did not know how to navigate the situation gracefully and chose the direct route, which I respect even if the conversation that followed was one of the most surreal of my life. She sat in the empty chair beside me and said quietly, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry, Adiz. I said, thank you. She said, for what it's worth, a lot of us always thought Karina had a talent for landing on her feet at other people's expense. I don't think most people are going to be surprised. I said, that's generous of you to say. She said, it's not generous. It's just true. Then she went back to her table. I finished my lunch. I made my professional rounds. I said goodbye to the women I always said goodbye to. I drove home. But what Delia had said and what I understood sitting in that parking lot afterward to be the real consequence of what was now in motion was that Karina's professional rehabilitation, the careful network she had been rebuilding over the past year, the reputation she had been reconstructing contact by contact, introduction by introduction, had just been hit by something she had not planned for and could not control. She had planned for Fletcher's opinion of her. She had planned for her attorney's strategy and the court's findings and the settlement's terms. She had planned, I think, for the possibility that Dorian and I might end in divorce and that Dorian might, eventually, choose her. She had been building toward a life on the other side of all of this. She had not planned for the people in her professional world to know what she had done. Not because the information was secret, but because she had believed, I think, that the story would be contained. That it would live inside my house and my marriage and my private grief. That I would be a woman who processed this quietly and moved on. She did not know me as well as she thought she did. And then came the legal outcome. The thing Priscilla and I had been building toward for 3 months. The thing that, in the end, gave me back everything they thought they had taken. Karina had walked away from her divorce from Fletcher with two things of real value: a cash settlement and a professional reference. The professional reference mattered because Karina had been out of the workforce for 6 years during the marriage. She had been a marketing consultant before Fletcher, respected in her field, the kind of professional whose name opened doors. But 6 years is a long time to be absent. The industry moves. Relationships lapse. Relevance erodes in ways that are nearly invisible until you try to walk back through the door and discover it no longer opens from your hand. One of the key references she had been using on every new application was a woman named Sable Drummond, who ran a boutique communications agency downtown. Sable had known Karina professionally for years before the marriage, had worked with her on 2 significant campaigns, admired her instincts, trusted her judgment. Sable's reference had opened at least 3 doors for Karina in the months since the divorce. Sable Drummond was also my client. I work in organizational development. I consult with businesses on team culture, leadership frameworks, internal communication strategy. Sable and I had worked together for 3 years, through 2 company growth phases and 1 difficult personnel restructuring. She was direct, principled, and she valued integrity in a way that was not performative. She had walked away from 2 lucrative contracts in the years I had known her because she did not believe in what the clients were asking her to build. I did not ask Sable to fire Karina or blacklist her, or make any calls on my behalf. I want to be very precise about this, because precision matters. I did not orchestrate a campaign. I did not call anyone else in the industry. I did not send emails or post anything or speak to anyone I was not in a direct relationship with. What I did was tell Sable the truth. I met her for coffee 2 weeks after the living room conversation. I told her the full story, not the emotional version, the factual one, the dates, the hotel receipts, the photographs from Renata's report, the month timeline, the nature of what had been happening while Karina was inside my home, using my hospitality as a staging ground for a parallel life. Sable listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me. I mean that." She paused. That tells me something about her judgment, about the way she makes decisions when she thinks the consequences are manageable. That's directly relevant to whether I can continue to represent her professionally. I said, "I understand." Sable withdrew the reference the following week. Without that reference, Karina's strongest application, the one she had been building toward, the agency role that would have rebuilt the most significant part of her professional identity, stalled. Then collapsed. The hiring manager, who had been warm and close to a decision, went quiet. The process stopped. She had to begin again, from a further starting point, with fewer allies and a changed understanding of what people in her professional world now knew and thought. In a competitive professional environment, at 43 years old, with a years-long employment gap and a reputation that was no longer entirely clean, that is not a small setback. That is a restructuring of the timeline. That is the difference between the life you planned and the life you have to build instead, brick by brick, in a much less forgiving landscape. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing when I understood the full weight of what that cost her. I felt something. A long, layered, complicated something that I have never been able to name cleanly. It was not satisfaction in the simple sense. It was more like the specific exhaustion that follows when something has finally stopped. The way a sound you've been living with so long you forgot it was there suddenly goes silent, and the silence is both relief and weight. But I also felt clear. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt clean. As for Dorian, the divorce was finalized 9 months after I filed. Priscilla was exceptional. Because of how carefully I had prepared, the documentation, the financial architecture I had quietly rearranged in those 3 weeks, the records that showed a complete and organized picture of 12 years of joint financial life. I walked away with the house, primary custody of Lena, and a settlement that Priscilla described at our final meeting as exactly what you are entitled to and not $1 less. Dorian moved into an apartment 20 minutes away. He sees Lena every other weekend. She handles it with the composure of someone who is 17 and has always been, in certain ways, wiser than the people around her. She does not discuss her father's life with me, and I do not ask. We have an understanding, Lena and I, that is built on the kind of mutual respect that is only possible between people who have been through something together and come out of it knowing each other better. One night, about a month after the divorce was final, Lena sat across from me at the dinner table, just the two of us, in our house, which I had repainted in a deep sage green that I had always wanted and Dorian had always called too dark, and she said, "I always knew something was wrong, Mom. I just didn't know what." I said, "I know, love." She said, "You were so calm the whole time. How were you so calm?" I thought about it. The real answer was not simple. The real answer involved 3 weeks of practice silence and a legal pad and a USB drive hidden in my car and an attorney who described herself as a precision instrument and a private investigator named Renata who had delivered more than I'd asked for. But the real answer was also simpler than all of that. I said, because I decided the night I found out that I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me. They had already taken enough. I was not going to give them my piece on top of everything else. Lena nodded. She picked up her fork. She said, "That's the right answer, Mom." We ate dinner. And there is one more thing. The last piece. The thing that happened 6 months after the divorce was final, that I did not plan, did not arrange, and could not have written better if I had tried. I had not spoken to Karina since the night in the living room. She had called twice in the weeks after from numbers I didn't recognize. She knew I had blocked her original number. I had not answered. She had written one letter, handwritten on cream stationery in the looping cursive she had always used, which I recognized from 14 years of birthday cards and notes left on my kitchen counter. I read it once, all the way through, standing at my kitchen counter in the morning light. I placed it in a folder. I did not respond. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a phone call from Miriam. It was a Wednesday afternoon in early autumn. I was working from home, sitting at the desk in my office with the window open, the smell of cold air coming in. Miriam's name appeared on my phone, and I felt, for a moment, the familiar warmth that her name had always produced in me, followed immediately by the more complex thing it now also produced. I answered. Miriam asked how I was. I told her honestly, better. Moving forward. Working. She said she was glad. She asked about Lena, and I told her about Lena's first semester at university, the first in our family, and Miriam made the sounds of genuine delight that grandmotherly women make when they hear about young people building their lives. Then her voice changed. Not dramatically, just slightly lower. More careful. She said she wanted to tell me something, and she asked if I was willing to hear it. I said yes. She told me that Karina and Dorian had been seeing each other. That after everything, after the living room and the documentation and the professional fallout and Miriam's own changed relationship with her daughter, they had continued seeing each other. Had, in fact, built something they were calling a relationship. I already knew this. Lena had mentioned it, carefully, in that measured way she had developed for conveying information about her father, without burdening me with it. I had received it the same way I received most information about Dorian now. Noted, filed, moved past. Miriam said that Karina had been telling her, over recent months, that this was real, that it was different, that she and Dorian were building something genuine, and that everything that had happened, the cost, the losses, the changed relationships, the professional setbacks, had been worth it. That she had chosen correctly. She had said that to her mother. I chose correctly. I sat with that for a moment. Then Miriam said, Dorian had ended it. For months into what Karina had described as their real relationship, the thing she had sacrificed 14 years of friendship for, the thing she had told her mother was worth all of it, Dorian had ended it. Not with a conversation. Not with the kind of honesty he had never managed to locate at any point in this story. He had sent a text that Miriam read to me in a voice that carried the particular flatness of a woman who is past the point of being surprised by the people she loves. The text said something to the effect of, things had shifted, he had developed feelings for someone else. He wished her well, he hoped she understood. That was it. Karina had called Miriam at midnight. She had been crying in the way that Karina cried when there was no audience to recalibrate around. Not the performing cry, the real one. She had said, I gave up everything for him. Miriam had sat with her on the phone for 3 hours. I listened to all of this very quietly. When Miriam finished, there was a pause. She said, "I don't know entirely why I'm telling you this." I said, "You're telling me because you need to say it to someone who understands exactly how much sense it makes." Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed. It was that particular laugh, the short, tired one, the laugh that belongs to women who have lived long enough to watch certain things complete themselves exactly the way they were always going to. She said, "You always were the sharper of the two of you. I should have seen it sooner." I told her that wasn't on her. I meant it. We talked for another 20 minutes about her garden, about the show she was watching, about her grandchildren, about the weather where she was. Normal things. Warm things. The kind of conversation that has nothing to do with betrayal or divorce or hotel receipts. The kind that is just two people who genuinely care about each other talking across a distance. When we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about Karina. Not with hatred. That had not been my register for a long time. With something that was cleaner and further away, the way you think about a thing when you have finally achieved enough distance from it that you can see its shape clearly. She had risked 14 years of friendship for a man who left her by text message. She had traded my loyalty for a relationship that lasted 4 months and ended on a screen. She had walked away from the only person who had ever shown up for her completely, through the marriage, through the divorce, through the worst nights, through the courtroom and the parking lots and the therapy waiting rooms. And she had done it for a man who was never going to be what she thought he was. Because a man who will betray his wife while that wife's best friend cries in the guest room has already told you everything about the way he makes decisions when something more convenient comes along. She just did not have the perspective to read it. That is not a comfortable truth. But it is a durable one. It holds up under examination. I have examined it many times. I thought about the night she knocked on my door in July in that winter coat. The broken-wheeled suitcase. The mascara rivers. The way she had said my name, as though it was the only safe word she knew. I thought about how quickly I had opened the door. And then I thought about the version of me who was sitting in this kitchen now. The one who had gone to sleep in a quiet house for the first time in months and had not cried into a pillow but had instead gotten up and made tea and picked up a legal pad. Who had sat across from a woman named Priscilla and been told she was the most prepared client she had ever received. Who had walked into a professional luncheon knowing that people were watching and had finished her lunch and made her rounds and driven home with her chin level. Who had kept her daughter in this house, in this green-painted kitchen, in this life that she had built and that was, now, entirely and completely her own. Some people talk about betrayal like it is the end of the story. Like the moment of discovery is the highest dramatic point, and everything after it is just the long, diminishing fade of recovery. That is not how it worked for me. For me, the discovery was the first clear moment. Everything before it had been a story I was telling myself about who my people were, and what they were capable of, and what I had built with them. The discovery was the moment the story became true. And the truth, even the terrible version, is always easier to build from than the beautiful lie. I poured myself a glass of wine. I sat at the kitchen table. Through the window, the evening light was doing the particular amber thing it does in early autumn, warm and sideways and specific in the way of late-season light, the kind that makes everything it touches look a little more itself. The same amber light from the same direction as the October night, 1 year earlier, when I had found the receipt. I thought, there is a symmetry in that. I appreciated it. I thought, I am 46 years old. My house is mine. My daughter is brilliant and kind, and at university building the life I always wanted her to have. My work is good and growing. My name is clean. I sleep without the sensation of something being constructed behind my back, and I know now how to recognize that sensation if it ever returns, and I know what to do when I do. I thought about the woman who had opened that front door in July, who had not asked a single question, who had loved first and trusted completely, who had thought that being the person who shows up, fully, immediately, without conditions, was the same thing as being safe. That woman was not wrong to love that way. She was wrong to love it without paying attention. The version of her sitting at this table still loved the same way, still believed in showing up, still believed that the deepest thing a person can do for another person is open the door without asking who's there. She just now knew to keep the receipt. She got here. She got here. If this one stayed with you, and I believe it did, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit you hardest. If you are new here, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. Stories about the people who don't just survive, they make sure the record is accurate. We will see you in the next one.